Does ein Carlos, come on stage already. Yeah. I first introduce you. Carlos, 2 years ago, I think, was it 2 years ago? There was a panel here, remember, on the next billion-dollar bubble. And I think Carlos was the first who said there will be a bubble, there will be a crisis.
I said we were in a crisis.
You're in a crisis, you said. So this is a man who can see into the future. And that's why we said, let's have Carlos coming back and moderate a panel on how all this changed the financial markets. What does it mean to invest? What is the environment? What did we learn? And it's controversial, I think, because you like it, controversial. Yeah, I know. You like to ask the tough questions. I hope so. And we'll see. Carlos, where do you come from now?
From Shanghai.
From Shanghai. How is the mood? Today is the New Year's Chinese day?
Yesterday was.
Yesterday was. So how is the mood in China?
Good, but getting worse.
Getting worse?
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Well, I mean, the press has reported on it as much more extensively than I have, but with GDP dropping from double-digit numbers down to potentially below the magical 8% per annum, it's quite disconcerting for us, both on an economic and on a social level.
Okay. So I see now our auditorium is full. There are a few seats left, but then I would ask you to call the panel on stage.
Sure.
Yes, and then we get started.
Thank you.
Applause for Carlos.
If I could ask our panelists to come up.
Kann ich Ihnen die Tasche hier lassen? Aber das ist alles drin, ne? Mein Ticket, Computer, die sind nachher noch da, ja? Sie sind Herr Hubble.
So as the panelists are getting seated, I have a very short brief before we get started today. And it's sort of laying out, please.
Is it here?
I'll sit here, yeah.
We need one more?
Two and two. No, I'll stand. It's fine. It's all right.
No, we take one more.
Dr. Cullen is always the gracious host. But our brief is very straightforward. Three constraints for today. The first, and which we'll get into as quickly as we can, is we'd like a little bit more participation from you, the audience, to get started. We think that we're looking into an unknown future, whereas a year ago, 2 years ago, one can characterize my statement as being correct. It was actually incorrect. Timing was wrong. And so we'll try to incorporate you as an audience onto our panel in a way which I'll describe in a second. The second brief is for us to be a little bit more definitive around some of how we project forward. We'll try to give you best guesses for how we think the future goes forward. However, to set that up, we'll start with a little bit of how we got here and what we've learned from how we've got here as a framework for how we go forward from here. And the third is we don't only want to look at things financially or economically. I had the pleasure of working with a great behavioral economist a few years ago. And he fundamentally believed that sociology, economics, and psychology and politics are intertwined and laid a foundation for what we're doing. So we'll go forward on that basis. So with that, what I'll do is introduce the panel, and I'll tell you how you guys are going to participate, and then we'll go from there. So to my extreme right, or I guess my left, Lars-Hendrik, who is from one of the emerging foremost institutions that thinks about what our panel is going to be speaking about. Martin Helusa, a gentleman who I have tremendous respect for in his current role, running APAC's, arguably, and certainly in my opinion, the foremost European private equity institution, and very accomplished in his individual career. Vivian Redding, who actually falls into the category of government, not regulator, not legislator, but government, in the European sense of the word. and has done a wonderful job, especially in the industries in which we are, many of us in the room are from, tech, media, telecom, or convergence, so to speak. Paul-Bernhard, a dear friend for many years, a friend from Buda, which many of you know, and Dave Drummond, a friend from increasingly a long time ago from the dot-com bubble, when the dot-com boom years and bubble and then boom again, when Dave was formerly an attorney and now with Google, and I was an investment banker in the Valley. So that's our panel. Here's how you're going to participate. We're going to break our panel up into three sections, our questioning into three sections. The first section is going to be about the past, like I mentioned earlier. How do we get to what we got to? There's a lot of smart people in this room, a lot of smart people on the panel, a lot of smart people outside of this room. How come none of us figured this thing out earlier? The second is, what did we learn? And the third is, what do we see going forward and as a group? What I'm going to do is, I've asked is for two quote-unquote runners with microphones. If, as we go through our questions and our discussions, you have an additional question, an additional comment, an objection, a criticism, or you just plain want to wake up the audience because it's the after lunch time slot, raise your hands. I'll keep an eye out and say your piece. And to the extent that we have time at the end, I will also call on you for questions. Great? So with that, I'll start with a general question, and I'll actually start with Madam Government. You're observing a wide swath of life from a government standpoint. And I would ask you to also break out a little bit out of your European context, but to include the US and emerging markets. Why didn't we realize that we were going to get into this mess earlier, especially given central bank policies?
Well, I think we all believe too much in ultra-liberalism. And we did not listen to those who, since 2005, told us that there was a real problem with lack of regulation. At that moment, when we were told that, and very frankly, Warren Buffett, for instance, in 2005 said that the whole financial system was a potential atomic bomb if the regulators did not really have an oversight which was more serious. At that moment, the regulation in the United States was even limited more. There was no regulation in Great Britain, and in Europe we still believed that the Thatcherism was a solution to all. Now we have all been very mistaken. We were taken by the dimension of the whole thing, because for the first thing, it is not only that one industry or only the banks in one geographical area are concerned, but because of globalization, a problem here makes a problem everywhere, and our regulation unfortunately was not prepared, which makes that we are coming back to what we have believed 70 years before already, that you need an equilibrium between the market forces and the social dimension.
Let me interrupt you and challenge you a little bit on your thesis, which is that over-regulation was a driver from a government standpoint. I would argue, as I did in 2007 it was, when I was here, that one of the biggest fundamental problems was an excess liquidity issue. And I would also argue that excess liquidity was fueled by central bank policies, especially in the United States, via rate cuts. Was there not an element of cooperation or coordination or some sort of systemic understanding between the central banks and their government counterparts to manage what was arguably the main fuel of the circumstances we found ourselves in, cheap money?
Cheap money is very important when it is not utilized for nonsense. You cannot give cheap money to somebody who doesn't have any guarantees, and that was exactly the policy in the United States. It was much less so the policy in Europe, because, for instance, in the construction and in property, you always needed to have a guarantee in Europe. But the problem is that in a globalized world, if something major happens in the United States, it sweeps over also to a more regulated Europe. But we have very much learned from this crisis that A, you are not an island anymore, whoever thinks it is, we are not anymore, and Europe has really to unite on its policies in order to be one of the driving forces in the world economy and in the world politics. And we have also learned that the recipes from the Reagan-Thatcher era were the wrong ones, and we have come down to earth where we have to find an equilibrium between regulation and market forces. The big danger now is that because of this crisis we overdo it to the other side. That would be as wrong as what has been done before. So to find this equilibrium for a social market economy will be the one where we can lead, because it bases on a truly European belief which has been established during decades and lost a little bit in the 80s and the 90s.
So surprise, surprise, the French got it right. Martin.
Oh, why the French?
Martin.
But you explain me that later.
The government and market forces thing you were talking about earlier. At least that's what they tell us in the United States. Martin.
I just wanted to say we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, the fact that this liquidity boom happened over the last 20 years also fueled something that we all probably think is a very good idea, which is globalization. It would not have been possible without credit, funding, trades and services building up all over the world. And certainly my industry, which is the private equity industry, benefited hugely from the creation of the whole securitization market, the whole shadow banking market, and you could argue that that too has led to huge growth in employment, huge growth in the efficiency of capital allocation. So clearly there was an excess, which we are now correcting, but as you say, is it not working? Besser. Okay. So as you are saying, I think the thing to avoid is the excess the other way around and destroying what we've actually gained over the last 20 years.
Martin, I don't buy it. Let me tell you why. I agree with you. Cheap money fueled or accelerated globalization to some extent, but globalization came along with the box container and with the internet thereafter. We can go and look at various points in time. That cheap money created two fundamental issues. One, we had significant consumer spend as a percentage of GDP in the United States. 70% of US GDP is consumer expenditures. And B, we had a fueling of the asset bubble, the real estate asset bubble in the United States, which those consumers turned to in these, as we know today, somewhat ill thought out securities, so to speak. So I would argue, no, that cheap money, to Vivian's point earlier, went into the wrong hands, was spent on the wrong things, and nobody stopped it, neither the governments nor the financial institutions. But it didn't necessarily fuel globalization directly in a positive way.
I don't know. For years, the American consumer has been mortgaging their house to create cash to buy goods and services which manufactured in China. So you could say that
that's my point.
The greatest social achievement over the last 25 years, in my point of view, was bringing 900 million Chinese out of poverty. And in a way, you can thank the US consumer for having helped to do that.
So your theory is we bankrupt 300 million consumers and go save 900 million. Interesting. Lars-Hendrik.
I just want to come in, echo a little bit. I think that thinking about Europe and how it fits into the rest of the world, I do think that Europe is very different. And I think in terms of explaining how the financial crisis has happened and taking forward from that, I think it's important to keep in mind where we are in Europe. I think in Europe we have come a long way in terms of regulation and getting the right kinds of regulation. I think that the US is very different in that way, and I think if we don't, I want to echo throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think that financial markets is one set of regulations, and I think there we are in need of thinking about macro as well as microeconomic policies, the moral hazard issues and all these kinds of things which have been discussed in the financial markets, I think are very important from an economic policy point of view. But then there are many other markets in Europe which are also regulated, and I think the danger of the current debate, sort of anti-market sentiment, also in my country, and there are important, in this country, important elections coming up, that if this crisis is sort of being used to move the wrong way in many other things we have achieved in Europe, where we've opened up markets, where we try to become more competitive, including some of the social issues which we have in Europe, which I think have to be a strength, question mark. But I believe they can if we do this efficiently and right. I think we don't want to screw that up and move the agenda forward, and I hope that the financial crisis is not going to lead us down the wrong path on many other things we need to do. For example, one more last point, all the state aid and subsidy programs which are coming up now. Sector by sector is going to ask for government money, not just the financial sector, the automobile, and that's a worldwide problem. We have a very strong governance program in Europe controlling subsidies. We've been very successful. The Commission has been very successful in lowering subsidies in Europe, targeting away from specific measures towards more horizontal measures. Keeping those principles alive, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. In light of this crisis, which is going to have social implications for all of us, I think is a major challenge for the future.
Yep. Paul-Bernhard and Dave comes from this, from companies in real industries that have experienced this. Some perspective.
Yeah, perhaps I'm allowed to add a little bit on what the cause of the crisis is, because I have a total different viewpoint on that one. It is not about the price of money, and it's not about regulation. I think the German BaFin, for instance, knew everything what happened in the German banking arena, and they didn't intervene. So it's not about having not known what happened or having not have the regulation options. They did simply not act. It is not about the price of money, because the price is even down today, so we wouldn't have a problem today because the price is at an almost all-time low. So I think that is not a problem. If you step one step back, I think the real underlying problem is the amount of debt we became acquainted with and the amount of leverage that is allowed. With tiny little equity, you could move over the last 20 years enormous amounts of money. Yeah. So you could do things which were out of your economic control and out of your economic reach. And that accelerated over time. And I think the real nature of the beast is that we have accepted by far too much leverage on our equity than was healthy. If you today, or if you bought a home in America 2 years ago, you could do that without any equity, which was absolutely impossible 30 years ago. So that is the real nature. Therefore, the situation we are in is deleveraging. We discussed today about deleveraging. It is not about regulation. It is not about bringing the price down. It's deleveraging, and that is harming our economies.
To support your point, to clarify, money was probably the wrong word. It's capital. To pick up on what Vivian pointed out, capital. It was the printing of capital, so to speak. Capital is both equity, currency, and debt. There was too much of it. And to really support your point, as a reflection of this, U.S. total outstanding debt at the end of 2008 is about 3.6 times GDP, which is a ridiculous overhang. In 1931, it was about 2.3 times, to give you some kind of gauge. So you're absolutely correct in terms of leverage.
The big question is, how do we survive an era, a couple of years, where we deleverage the whole economy? And I think that is a new adventure, because we have seen something like that never before. There is no blueprint, there is no role model. And that government almighty can solve that problem, I don't buy into.
Sure. Before I ask Dave to comment, Martin, you picked up on a thought earlier about the cyclical versus structural nature of this phenomenon. Is this an appropriate point for you to add to that?
The question was, quite loud.
Oh, we probably want to get. You picked up on the thought of, to what extent are the factors that we're facing cyclical versus structural? And as the two phenomena we're talking about, one is cyclical, one is structural. Perhaps you can add some comments on that.
Yeah, I think the cycle we're going through now is going to be so deep and so profound that it will bring with it structural change everywhere. In government, in the general economy, I think all businesses will be touched. I disagree a little bit. I think the cost of capital will increase significantly. Both debt and equity costs are huge. Debt will not be available, equity will not be available. So I think profits will decline structurally for a very long time in the industry. And you can see the stock market, which is already preempting that. And you can already see in the financial services industry, you can see the structural changes. So investment banking is gone, right? After Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley became bank holding companies. Wholesale banking, which is offering debt on the basis of wholesale financing, is basically gone. I think the profitability of banks is going to be significantly lower going forward. Profitability in the banks and therefore compensation will be significantly lower. So we're going through massive structural changes in the financial services industry. I think government is going through structural changes. I think revenues in governments are going to be lower. Debt payments, debt service is going to be much more expensive. So again, I think there are going to be huge structural changes there, and you will have huge amount of innovation necessary to make both government, financial services, but also general industry more productive in these lower profit environment. All of that will be structural.
Dave.
Sure. Let me chime in with one more perspective on the cause here. To the extent you believe this sort of all started back in the United States, you can't overlook the American political system and how it operates, right? Going back to your original question, why didn't people see this coming? Well, a lot of people did see it coming. And the administration that we had for 8 years certainly had an ideological predisposition against regulation. Certainly they had they were sort of not paying attention because of a couple of wars that we were fighting. But remember how things get done in our government. And when you look at the investment banks being able to convince the SEC to go from 12-to-1 leverage to 33-to-1, if you look at Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, kind of government agencies but really private, who had the biggest lobbying arms in the city, our system has allowed interests to go in and sort of prevent regulation affirmatively. And I think that has a lot to do with where we are. And it's also why what Obama is doing with regard to transparency in government, with regard to sort of keeping lobbyists away at arm's length going forward is going to be an incredibly important thing.
I think that's a really, really insightful comment. I'm wondering if anybody from the audience has anything to add to these perspectives. Are we still in that post-lunch phase? How many people in the room are your net worth receded by some percentage in 2008? Please raise your hands. We still have a bunch of wealthy people in this room, I'm noticing. And how many of you want to recapture that net worth recession that you experienced in 2008 sometime in the next 3 years? Please raise your hands.
Sure. So
you must have a perspective. You lost money, you want to make money back, and you have no perspective. We've got a perspective here, sir.
To me, the discussion feels...
Could you please introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name's Keith Tier. I live in California, British by birth. The discussion seems too tactical to me. I'll disclose that I was a sociology major, and I went to university in 1974, and we read a lot of Karl Marx in those days. And it's, there's a lot to be said for some of the things he talked about, particularly the dependency of capitalism on credit, which he talked a lot about, and the requirement of credit to prevent crisis, the business cycle, if you like. And it seems to be pretty structural that credit suddenly is going to be unavailable. That doesn't seem to be a minor point. It seems to be a pretty major point. And whether you're not to be either pessimistic or optimistic, just to be realistic, capitalism without credit isn't capitalism anymore. And therefore, what is it? And the relationship between the state and the private sector seems to be central here. Rosa Luxemburg, who those of you who are German should have heard her name, and if you haven't, go and try and find out who she was, talked a lot about the growing involvement of the state in the private sector during the period after the First World War. And then it kind of went away. Through the Second World War and the post-war boom, there was enough growth that the world seemed a different place. Well, it's starting to look like the same place.
Thank you.
So I just wonder, if we can get less tactical and more global and big picture in how we
let's get practical. I asked Martin again. Martin, there's a lot of this liquidity that was out there, and actually a lot of it has been repatriated into the coffers of a lot of investment firms that are sitting on the sidelines. Could you talk a little bit about why that liquidity is sitting on the sidelines, and what might cause it to unloosen, and more importantly, where it might unloosen?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the gentleman is absolutely right. And I mentioned earlier, I think we are going through a structural change. But I think Anglo-Saxon capitalism is not dead. And the major driver of it, which is greed, at the end of the day, is not dead and will reappear once fear is overcome. And I think what will get the greed going again are the low valuations we are seeing currently in the market. And I was just taking a note this morning, just to give you an idea of how valuations have corrected. Royal Bank of Scotland paid $100 billion for ABN AMRO, right? For that amount of money, they could today buy Citibank, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Deutsche Bank, Barclays, and still have $8 billion left over, which is enough to buy GM, Ford, Chrysler, and the Honda Formula One team. So at what point will prices be so low, or Google at 9 times EBITDA, so low that the machine will start again? And it will certainly happen. The big question is when. I don't think it's going to happen this year or next year, but at some point, Anglo-Saxon capitalism will work its wonders again.
And you touch on a next key element, which is this whole issue of to what extent do we allow the crisis to resolve itself versus interventionism. Put specifically, when is interventionism too much? So let me pose another question that starts, I guess, to some extent with the regulators, flows into industry, and I'm agnostic as to which way we start. You know, here we are, we're about to spend in the United States and in other parts of the world, not billions, but trillions of dollars of taxpayer dollars into failed businesses. Darwinian theories would suggest that you let these things fail. I mean, imagine Detroit were making cars that nobody wanted. They were lending you money to buy this product that nobody wanted. And now we're supposed to keep pouring money into that cycle. I mean, that math doesn't compute for me as an investor. However, there's social implications to the gentleman's earlier point and to Vivian's earlier point with respect to how far a government can go and how far a government cannot go. Shall we comment a little bit on that from the panel? This morning, Paul-Bernhard, we were talking about the German public TV subsidies that are being contemplated at this point, as an example. When should the public step into, stay out of, and have a balance of where? And I think, Professor Roller, you started with some perspective, and then maybe we can jump to Paul-Bernhard or vice versa.
The microphone?
Who's got the device?
So I think that generally around the world there's huge taxpayers' money being spent. I was sort of involved in some of the discussions here in Germany. We've just, as most of you know, agreed, or I think tomorrow the cabinet is agreeing on 50 billion stimulus package. Now, if you look at that, you know, first of all, first question is that enough? And I think similar discussions are right now going on in the US with the Obama incoming administration. And clearly, I don't think anybody really knows at this point. I think one question, actually, the Chancellor, Mrs. Merkel, was asking us just before Christmas when we had this Konjunkturgipfel in the Chancellery, all these expert economists, and I was one of them, not being somebody who really believes he can predict the future, but some of my colleagues actually do. How bad is it? And what is the projections, for example, for growth in terms of Germany for next year? And I think the consensus was by the end of the discussion, which was sort of late at night after 6 hours, is that nobody really knows. And anybody who pretends to know forecasting growth rates, for example, for the German economy for next year, is not doing his job properly. So I think we don't know. And I think the 50 billion, if you look at that, is of course sizable. I think Germany has finally come through. It'll be interesting to hear the Commission under lots of pressure, because Germany is clearly also free riding on stimulus packages with other countries are doing. Germany, I think, is coming through with a sizable stimulus package after having waited also for the Obama move, which is now becoming apparent. A lot of that money goes into, now to come to your question, we don't want to waste taxpayers' money. And I think that's why it's important that you think about long-run structural investments. And a lot of it goes into infrastructure. A lot of it goes into education. At similar technology, and I think this is similar to the, I think, very able team, economic advisory team of Mr. Obama, and I think that is good. There was a discussion of short-run consumption Gutscheine, which I think was a bad idea. Luckily, that is taken off. short-run stimulus consumption packages are probably a waste of money in terms of taxpayers' money. So I think let's wait and see. I think there's hope that these things are going to work. Now, more specifically, last one more sentence in terms of social implications. For example, if you take the automobile industry, clearly, if we let that die to some extent, and I think it's a bit of a bigger problem perhaps now in the US, that sector as it is, for example, in Germany, because I think there are long-run structural issues there, there will be some social implications. And that is, by the way, nothing new. We've been tackling with that at the European Commission when we decide on state aid. For example, we had to decide whether we give a state aid to the Gdansk shipyard in Poland. You know, that's history, what happened there 20 years ago. Mrs. Cruz, a colleague of Mrs. Redding, had to decide, and of course it means a lot. And I think we have a set of rules, coming back to my earlier point, where we balance, maybe that's the best way of putting it, social consideration with economic, long-run survival type of arguments. I think we need to stick to that. One last sentence, when we think about European aid to European companies, we have, as I said before, a set of rules in Europe so that we don't go into subsidy races at the European level. But if the Americans are starting to do it, or other nations, it's not so clear how we resolve that problem to keep the level playing field, which I think is very important to keep at the global scale.
Paul-Bernhard.
I think there's a structural element and there is a rescue element to it. The structural element, I think everybody agrees that the state, the governments, should be involved in as few situations as possible because it proves over the history that it is the worst owner for most properties. The big question is, what do we do in the rescue situation? Because we are facing something right now which we have never experienced. And my expectation is that very soon almost all banks will have been nationalized, whatever that means to international banks, who is the national owner. And we will have a discussion in most important industries, step after step, that governments should do something to rescue. It's extremely difficult to find out how far can a government go without destroying the system. And I hope we will find the right point, but I don't think that we have a blueprint for this today.
Well, may I say one or two words to the banks? The reason why the European governments invested into saving the banks was not for the sake of the bankers. It was for the sake of having the possibility to lend money to the industry, to the SMEs, and to the startups. Because when there is no more refinancing of those industries, we are going to have serious industrial problems. And that brings me to the second point, to the subsidies. Personally, I'm completely against subsidies. Most of all subsidies to industries which don't have a business model which is viable. That is money spent without necessity. It's better sometimes to leave an industry die rather than to keep it during 2 or 3 years artificially alive and then it dies nevertheless. But sometimes there is this very delicate equilibrium that you have to keep between the employment, the very heavy employment in an area, and a non-viable industry on the long run. And that is why it is so important that we do not leave each region, each government to take its own decision in Europe. If not, it would be a race to subsidies. And that is why we have the European rules, which are applied, and subsidies always being a state aid. It is the Commission which tries to find the equilibrium between subsidizing for the sake of subsidizing or for purely political reasons, or subsidizing for the sake of building up a new industry. And then I would like to come back to one of the most important words which have been said. I think it was you who said, we need to invest into innovation. And their subsidies...
We're going to get to there in the future section. Yes, absolutely. Okay. We'll spend a fair bit of time on that. Dave, some comments.
Just one other thing. I mean, one of the things that's remarkable about the Obama stimulus and what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now is here you have a country that is probably the most against, its citizens have been the most against government intervention in the economy of any place on the planet, and almost overnight, there's going to be extreme support for this, and we will pass a very, very large stimulus bill. And you start thinking about, well, why is that? Well, we have infrastructure that's been crumbling for years and years and years. We lag the world in broadband. It's very clear, but yet, have produced the most sort of internet companies, global internet companies that sort of utilize that, and still we lag the world on that. We've known for a long time that our dependence on foreign oil was going to get us in trouble, and that we have technologies and business ideas and business plans and approaches that can deal with that, whether it's renewables or it's energy efficiency, and we've done nothing. So the Americans understand that there is now an opportunity to go after those things and deal with those things through government, because for a variety of reasons, fiscal mismanagement by government, incumbents who've prevented things from happening in certain industries, we now have an opportunity to do that, and that's what's driving the public support.
But again, the numbers don't bear out the facts also. I hear you,
well,
and
there's a big
that's
chunk
all
of
cool.
it. There's a big chunk of it. A lot of it is infrastructure.
Yeah,
you're right. No, in fairness, you're right. The Republicans have a good point.
Of course I'm right. The numbers show it.
To some extent, you're right. But I think if you look at what people, and is this bill getting larded up with lots of other things that may not deal with the stimulus? That may be true, but there's a substantial amount for things that are going to drive new industries, and that's very, very.
But here, I'm just going to drop the numbers on you. 750 million going into industries that are underperformed, that have screwed up.
You're talking about the TARP
TARP,
bailout.
and then you look at 800 stimulus. The percentage of that that's going into what you're talking about is not even close to 10%. It's not even close.
No, that's true. It's more than 10%.
So
infrastructure is a big piece of it. You're forgetting infrastructure. Don't look at just green and broadband. The infrastructure.
And we haven't defined infrastructure in a reasonable way, but that's all right. So the governments are spending. I'd like to go back to close this section. A word that Martin mentioned earlier: globalization. Something that, living in China, I feel very passionate about. I would argue, and Fareed Zakaria has been making this argument extremely persuasively recently, that in fact, yes, we are in an economic/financial crisis, and we feel a fair bit of that. But in fact, what we are experiencing are the natural effects of globalization. Put bluntly, 63% of the world's population discovered this game called capitalism in the last 30 years. Arguably, globalization really took off, really accelerated when Deng Xiaoping announced openness in '78. And inevitably, the other 37%, which held the preponderance of the wealth of the world, will have some receding. I'm not suggesting a zero-sum type of game, but I'm suggesting a balancing of that, of the wealth, economic, military, and political power of the world. Are we not experiencing effectively the first phase of that? Within that, does the US and Europe not have a diminished role? And then within that, what happens to the free rides that the world has enjoyed, that the US has provided over the last 20, 30 years, whether it's the Department of Defense or the Centers for Disease Control, et cetera, what takes up that slack? So in summary, globalization versus economic, quotes, crisis. Secondly, diminished role of the US. And third, what picks up for the US not being able to afford to pay for those free rides that we've enjoyed? Martin.
That's a lot of questions.
It usually is with me.
All of a sudden. I think one needs to pick apart two different things. First of all, there is a financial crisis, and then there's an economic crisis. Okay, the financial crisis started in the United States, then grew to Europe and to the financial centers. It seems to me clear what needs to be done to fix the financial crisis, which is that the governments create a bad bank and take on all the toxic assets of the banks currently. That's the one most important thing that can be done, and that's what this TARP money should be used for, not to subsidize industries which are on their way out anyway, which is unfortunately, due to populist wishes, happening anyway. So that's on the financial crisis, but it seems to me that that is going to be fixed in the next year by governments, which then leaves the question of the economy. And there, I think I agree with you. I think this globalization is unstoppable, driven by, for example, information technology, driven by the free movement of talent and people. You know, there's brilliant Indians moving to Silicon Valley, to London, and so on. And it seems to me that that will pick up relatively quickly as soon as the financial crisis is digested. That, however, will take at least 2 or 3 years because we have to get rid of about $60 trillion of financial assets, which will only happen, unfortunately, through deflation. And that is going to take, a long time to get through the system.
It's ironic you mentioned the financial crisis, and for the audience, to wake you up again, a little bit of humor. While the West was printing these derivatives at ridiculous ratios, the mic please for the gentleman over here, these ridiculous ratios of derivatives to underlying asset values, securities, they were simultaneously lecturing the Chinese banks about non-performing loans, for those of you who remember. And today, the most controlled / regulated / whatever word you choose to use, nation on planet Earth, not only has the largest savings on planet Earth, has the healthiest and highest equity value financial services sector. Now, isn't that ironic? Something that we should maybe learn from as we go forward and talk about drivers of change. Martin, a counter response? Or the gentleman, let's...
Yeah. If I could just follow up on your remarks.
And who are you, sir?
My name is Johan Butting. I'm from Google. You said that deflation is the only way how to get the various bad assets out of the system. Economics would argue that inflation is a second possibility to achieve this. Why are you so certain that it is deflation and not inflation?
My view is we will have both. Yeah. We have to go through a period, just to give you the historical context, we have about 70 trillion US dollars of world GDP. And we have about $240 trillion of world financial assets, which is over 3 times GDP. Over the last 50 years, it's been about 1.8 to 2 times. And we're going to have to get back to that level. So $100 trillion have to come out of the system. About $30 trillion have come out of the system so far, which has another, I would say, $60 to $70 trillion to come through. I don't see any other way to get rid of that but through deflation. After that, we're going to have, I believe, massive inflation, because one of the ways we're going to get rid of it in the meantime is because the governments are putting on a huge amount of debt, and they will be able to only finance that through inflation. So I think we're going to have several years of deflation and then massive inflation.
Yeah, I would concur with you. Let's hope that the deflation is as short as possible. Probably the inflation is just unavoidable, which is bad enough.
So we agree.
Any other panel members want to comment on the globalization and US thoughts, please?
Well, globalization we do have. We have seen it. If we didn't have had globalization, the crisis wouldn't have spread as it is. Did the US and Europe lose importance? I can only speak for Europe. Before globalization and before the economic crisis, Europe was not as united as it is today. Because I think both things have made Europe to understand that you cannot go nation by nation anymore, and that our only way out is to build this internal market of 500 million citizens, to get rid of the barriers, and to speak with one voice, and to take the lead. We have done it in the financial crisis, where it was the Europeans who came out and said, we need an international gathering in order to take the regulatory decisions which are pending. On climate change, Europe was taking the lead, putting a very big risk at taking this lead, and we are very happy that we might be followed now by the new American president, and then bring the world to a new decision. So I think that out of globalization, Europe has started to become much more solid, much more one voice, and much more credible, and a world leader and not a world follower.
Thank you.
I'm an old-fashioned economist, I have to admit. Therefore, I would like to say that the basis of globalization was not debt, not at all. If it had an element to it, it stopped after the Asian crisis in 1997. So matter of fact is that the developing economies are lending money to the US and not the other way around. Globalization was driven by free trade. That was the key. And I think one of the big threats that we are having today is that we go back to protectionism, because it looks for governments more easy to solve their problems at home by raising walls again and stopping free trade. And I very much and sincerely hope that that will not happen, because that will destroy value all over the world. I personally don't see a diminished role for the US. It is the biggest economy in the world, and it will recover. It will go through difficult times, but it is most likely the nation to turn around the most quick, much more quicker than any other nation. Free ride is something, frankly speaking, I don't see. The fact that we are harmed in our financial institutions in Europe is only based on the fact that there was no free ride, because we did finance the mortgages, for instance. So we lost money because of the interdependencies in the financial system. So we paid our bill. There was no free ride.
I guess we've sort of beaten the what have we learned and what are the key drivers of change to death. Did you have a comment?
I just had one more point on this globalization issue, building on what was said before, that I think the economy, and clearly we're globalizing, whether it's a zero-sum game, who are the winners and the losers, is an interesting debate. You can scare lots of people in Europe by saying the Chinese are coming. I think that's all interesting debate to have, but I think another debate to have is, do we have the global governance structures to go with it? It goes a little bit in that direction in Europe. I think we have governance structures. It has even strengthened under this development. But I really think we need to do more in terms of global governance structures. It's clearly, goes through all the debate we're having. It's important, of course, to have a strong player like the US on climate issues behind the Europeans. But I think multilateral global governance structures, I think in all areas, are going to be more and more important, because national tendencies, protectionist tendencies, which are there, are a problem. If the world is global, but politics is local in the bad sense, I think we have a problem for all of us. One example, the International Competition Network, which is a governance structure, which keeps markets open. Everybody follows the competition rules, which is one area. We've been trying to get China into that. That's important. I think that a country like China, even though it's not a democratic country the way we like to think of it, integrating that into global governance structures and open and negotiating free access to that country, and it's just passed, by the way, a competition policy law 6 months ago. China did. Those sorts of things, I think, are very important in terms of making the value, the benefits of globalization coming about.
All right. By the way, excellent point. To reflect one key point that you made, which is about the need for a more global management system. I'm not so sure I want to use regulatory or oversight or governance of any of these words, but management system was the G7/G8's concession finally that China, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, etc. actually matters when they convened in Washington. Of course, it was telling that it was convened in Washington, the bankrupt nation, the capital of the bankrupt nation, as opposed to in Beijing, where we have assets. So we still obviously have an affinity for debt that's meant to be humorous.
Can I make one more point on that? Just before Christmas, by the way, as you know, the Doha round, WTA talks, again just failed. If you want an economic stimulus package, leaving sort of trade issues, difficult agricultural trade issues aside, getting further along with the Doha round is an excellent stimulus program, which might be much bigger than anything else we do.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're going to transition now into the future, and here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to ask some really quick, rapid-fire questions that require things like yes, no, maybe, 2020 kinds of answers, and you'll get it as I ask. I'm going to ask 5 of these, and I'm going to ask the panelists to comment on them. And at the end of each one of these yes, no type questions, I'll take a show of hands on whether you believe us or not, right? So we're going to start with the following.
What
First one and the obvious one. This is just a couple of, this is really short-term into the future questions. Question number 1, Dave, do we have a further correction in the stock markets in the West or not? Yes or no?
No.
Yes.
Paul-Bernhard, yes.
I don't know.
I got a maybe on that one.
Yes.
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 So we got 3 yeses and a maybe. How many people believe that there will be further correction in financial markets? Raise your hands, please. Really pessimistic crowd,
Dave,
man.
you
Dude,
lost.
MrInnovation.com over here. All right. Okay. Now this one has to do with a date. So you could pick 5 years or 10 years or whatever, anything you feel appropriate, right? To date, growth was fueled a lot by leverage. And that in turn fueled M&A activity. That's really stalled. A lot of M&A activity is stalled, a lot of growth is stalled because, quotes unquote, of the lack of leverage. When will that return to the market? When are we going to see the market start? First question, when will we see markets, key sectors of the industry, key companies start to grow tremendously, do you think? Dave, I know you're growing right now, but give me a general answer.
We're already growing.
I understand. Give me more than a Google answer there.
It's a couple more years.
You got 2.
If I take out inflation, 5 years.
5.
It will not be a tremendous growth. It will be a slow growth. And this might start at the end of this year.
Sorry, 1, 2, 5.
2011.
Yeah.
So you
because
give
of
me 2.
inflation. Because of inflation.
Yeah, among others, yeah.
Take out inflation.
Next year, 2010.
So we've got an average of 2 here. Do you all believe that we start expanding in 2 years? Raise your hands. Still a lot of pessimism going on here, dude.
Well, they might think it's 1. They might think it's 1. They might be more optimistic.
You're already growing. I mean,
All right, fine.
you got to call the 5th on this one.
That's fine.
All right. Next question. And this is about global dynamics, a little bit about global dynamics, and looking at it on a little bit more regional of a perspective. Is the U.S. less or more attractive for foreign investment today? Dave?
Right now?
Right now.
Less.
I was about to give you $20 into Google, but thanks for telling me that. Paul-Bernhard?
I'm very sad to say yes.
Less.
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 More.
More.
Less.
So we have 1 more. I'll actually go for more also on that. And 3 yeses. So less. So how many of you think the U.S. is less attractive for investment today? We're getting warmer. Good. Okay. Next question, which is also regional in nature. Is China more or less attractive for investment today? Dave?
Wow, less.
Less.
More.
More.
It's the same.
Less.
Less.
More.
So we've got if I'm going to be the tiebreaker, I'm going to argue, interestingly enough, despite being in China and being a very big bull on China, I would actually argue less. The caveat being it's today we're talking about. Right. Do you all believe less or more in the markets? Less. Okay, everybody agrees. And last, and most importantly, and this is especially pertinent to my friend Mr. Drummond, are companies that have performed in years prior to now, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, in a hyper-growth environment, such as Google. Are they plateauing, especially due to the crisis and the effects of the crisis that we were talking about? Yes or no?
It depends.
Plateau.
Are they innovating or not?
Plateauing, you tell me.
No, I mean, I think it's an artificial concept. I mean, you plateau if you don't do anything. But if you do, you won't.
So, so inherent in your answer should be whether you think they're innovating or not, and therefore whether they're growing or not. So you pick one.
I think their growth will return because I think the innovation continues.
So not plateauing.
Not plateauing.
After 15 years, almost all companies are reaching a plateau.
Yeah.
The big ones are plateauing and they are investing into future, and that is why I think we should speak about innovation.
Martin?
I think I agree with her. I think there will be new Googles, maybe not Googles, but new companies solving the problems coming towards us, and they'll be huge.
It depends.
I got a feeling I'm not going to ask you for your vote on that one. So those were the short zingers. Interestingly enough, and appropriately so, we were transitioning to innovation. It's startling, and I use Google as the trademark example of this in the last the last couple of downturns, the dot-com bubble, and now this quotes-unquote financial crisis. One can also make the same and similar arguments for Cisco if one looks at Cisco's rise and troughs over the years. Microsoft also went through these cyclical eras. One can argue that the best innovations occur in down cycles. And in fact, the most sustainable equity values, either organically or transactionally, are in fact created in down values because we've got innovation and we've got appropriate asset values. Can we talk a little bit about what this cycle might mean looking forward for innovation and what in turn that might manifest itself in equity values on a forward basis? Martin, I think Martin was dying to do this, and then I'll ask Vivian.
We only have 3 minutes left. I got to get my.
No,
my
I think we got a
in.
little bit of an extension because we were a little bit late.
Okay, fine. I mean, if you look over the last 10 years, one of the greatest sources of value creation was, in fact, the financial markets. The power of leverage and financial engineering. And it seems to me that that is now gone for quite a period of time. And therefore, other sources of value creation have to be looked for, and they are going to be operating improvements. And these operating improvements, I think, will target an increase of profitability in the companies, which I think in future will be down because the financial engine is gone. And those operating improvements will be the ability to handle complexity. And that will be driven through IT, through companies like Google, through search, through collaborative technologies, and so on and so forth. And I think that's where a lot of the innovation and a lot of the value creation will come from.
Vivian.
Look, I said before that I am completely against subsidies. But I am for investment into the future. And that is innovation. And I think that we in Europe, we learned the lessons. Where are our biggest problems, we can make our biggest successes. I quote you two. The first one is our demographic change, an aging society. With this aging society, we have to invest into e-health systems. And our research and our innovation in e-health is booming, going to the right way. That means here, when we start to come out of the crisis, we have a real success story building up. And the second one, of course, is the energy crisis and the energy security. We are too dependent, so we have to create the alternatives, and the energy efficiency. So both crises force us to invest into research, into innovation. We are doing that, and that is why I have this tendency of being optimistic. Except of all these crises, I think if we invest in the right systems now, we will boom when the time of crisis is going a little down, and this we can see at the end of this year, beginning of next year.
Dave.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with your thesis. I would venture to even go so far as to say that during the depths of this depression, recession, whatever you want to call it, at least one company will get founded that will be at least as successful as Google in innovation and in value creation. I'm convinced of it. I think in our business we sometimes go a bit more from, less, we revolve less around the business cycle than we do around a hype cycle. And I think when you get in these downturns and the hype goes out of the industry, people actually start paying attention to actually doing business. And I think innovation is part inspiration, but it's also execution and hard work.
30 seconds.
Just very quickly, role of universities. I think that's also extremely important.
Yes.
Even if you look at countries like China, they're making amazing progress, especially in the applied research area. I think reforming and having the top research institutions, including universities in Europe, is extremely important for innovation.
Paul-Bernhard.
First of all, it's very hard for me to describe what happened in the finance industry as innovation. So the second thing, for sure, it's all about innovation, real innovation that change our business models and that will foster growth. All companies who are not able to innovate themselves fundamentally will not survive in that market condition.
My two points would be, in addition to innovation, a point that I think Martin implicitly stated will be a new focus on accountable operating metrics. And I think that's something that we haven't been able to touch on that's going to be tremendously important in the next 20 years. It'll be new and accountable forms of leadership Mr. Obama is only the first scratch of the surface of that, but I think we're going to see that throughout organizations that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, especially in industry. Yes, sir.
And different compensation structures.
Greed is good, but not too good. I will end by just asking the conference organizers for 1 minute if there's a pressing question or a compelling question by anyone in the audience to stump our erstwhile panel with, we will take it. Yes, sir.
There's another one.
45 seconds and 45 seconds. I'm in target recession.
From Wellington Partners. I would like to comment or ask a follow-on question to something Paul-Bernhard says in a side question, talking about innovation in terms of the financial sector producing innovation. When I was an investment banker between 1988 and 1995, I saw the smartest people, the smartest mathematicians, the smartest physicists move into the financial sectors to create derivative products. What they have created with that intellectual capacity is a huge disaster, as we all figured out. The question is, how can we redirect innovation and intellectual capacity into the right direction for society? And Martin, I unfortunately don't believe that greed is the right motivator, because greed will always lead to misdirection. So how can we redirect resources, mainly intellectual resources, into what's good for society?
15 seconds, Paul-Bernhard.
I think for the financial industry, trust is gone. And that is the primary correction. Nobody will buy these products any longer. And so I don't think that talent will go there for the next foreseeable future.
Okay, and then one quick...
Hi, I'm Mark Goldberg from Paris. The question is the private equity model broken? And if so, how can it be fixed, given that private equity and venture capitalism is and has been the fuel of innovation globally? And it's broken in the sense that there is roughly 1 trillion asset supposedly available inside the hands of private equity houses, but at least 30% of that money does not exist because the LP don't have the money because the money has been returned to them. So the money is just not there, which is why the groups are just not making new investment, therefore the model is broken.
Martin.
Yeah, I don't think the model is broken. If you look at the statistics, the average returns of private equity firms over the last 20 years has been the same as the leveraged S&P, so they have created no value. It's only the top quartile of private equity that ever made any money and was able to really fuel value creation in the economy. What you're going to see in the next years is the 75% dying, and the 25% will survive. And they will survive because they have something to bring to the party, which is superior governance, being able to select and back the right companies, and that will continue to be of great value.
I'm tempted, if Hubert would allow me to take your question, sir. Please, the micro, and then that'll be it. Yes, sir.
Tomorrow, Nassim Taleb will be on stage, and you're lucky he's not here today. He pointed out that 3 weeks prior to Iceland's currency becoming worthless, no one in Iceland had a clue that was going to happen. Why are all of you so sure about the pronouncements you're making? And given the suddenness and the extreme unlikeliness of this meltdown, where's the humility?
We are, I think we are guessing just as much as everyone else is, but we're hopefully having more educated guesses. On behalf of Hubert, Marcel, Steffi, and everybody at DLD, I'd really love to thank the entire panel. Very, very insightful comments for coming here and participating with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well done, Paul.
And thank you, the audience. Thank you.
Well done.